Stories where a person travels back in time first emerged in literature during the second half of the 19th century. The earliest work of this kind is generally considered to be Mr. Brucheck's Journey to the 15th Century, written in 1888. Over time, these stories evolved into a distinct genre known as time travel fiction. There have been countless books and films on this topic released over the past decade. It's worth noting a trend these days. The concept of traveling not to the real past, but to various alternate worlds resembling medieval Europe is gaining more popularity. In these stories, the main character usually gains incredible abilities for one reason or another, quickly becomes the best swordsman and dominates, humiliating local villains and other unfriendly life forms. But what would really await a modern person if they were transported, not even to the real Middle Ages, but to a somewhat idealized version of it? What kind of weapon should they choose? That's exactly what we'll be talking about today. First, let's note that the Middle Ages is a period that began with the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, and roughly speaking, ended in the 16th century. During this time, Europe was largely ruled by the peoples whom the Romans called barbarians. The early Middle Ages, which lasted from the 5th to the 11th century, despite being considered a dark time, actually offered a surprising amount of freedom and, as we'd call it today, social mobility. Those fortunate enough to be born agile, strong, or with other well-developed traits could, with a bit of luck, find their place in the sun. You don't have to look far for examples. The early princely retinues are a prime case. At first, any skilled fighter could join them, though over time these groups became hereditary. Essentially, most European feudal lords owed their status to some wild ancestor who either caused trouble or made a name for themselves in the past. If the ancestor was not only a great fighter but also managed to establish a successful gang, it's likely we're talking about the rise of a princely lineage. However, in various works of fiction, films, and even games, the focus tends to be on the characteristics of the classic or even late Middle Ages, a period that began around the 11th century. By this time, society had become rigid, and the peasantry, which made up roughly 90% of the population, was dependent in one way or another. If you weren't lucky enough to be born into a noble family, the chances of climbing the social ladder were very slim. But let's get to the point. What would await you in a somewhat abstract, slightly romanticized, and friendlier version of the classic Middle Ages? Let's say, as it often happens in books, you find a special place and end up in the past. The very fact of your arrival brings the first problem. The population of medieval Europe in the 11th to 14th centuries was about 10 times smaller than today, meaning population density was quite low. However, the main problem isn't so much that you'd have to wander for a long time in search of a settlement, but something else entirely. Up until modern times, and in some parts of Europe even into the 20th century, wild animals, especially predators, posed a real threat. According to researchers, about a third of today's wolf population is potentially capable of attacking humans, particularly women and children. According to Silantiev's book on hunting practices in Russia during the 19th century, from 1870 to 1887 alone, wolves claimed the lives of about 1,500 people just in the European part of Russia. We can also recall 18th century France and the beast of Gévaudan, which was attributed to over 200 attacks on people within a 3-year span. And this was already during a time when quite decent firearms existed. Overall, a walk in nature during the Middle Ages was far less romantic than it is today. However, contact with the local population would bring up a few more issues, the first of which is the language barrier. Even if you ended up in one of the principalities of Rus, you would quickly discover that the language you speak differs significantly from the medieval version of Old Church Slavonic. Interestingly, this has become one of the pieces of evidence for the forgery of the so-called Velez book, as the text claiming to be an ancient written source is relatively easy to read, while understanding the same old Slavic manuscripts from the 12th century poses quite a challenge for philologists. However, if you found yourself in Central or Western Europe, knowing a European language wouldn't necessarily make things easier. It's also worth noting that despite the variety of European languages, for a long time, up until the modern era in some countries, Latin remained the primary form of written communication. In several countries, such as England, Spain, and the Kingdom of Hungary, Latin was the official language until the 18th and 19th centuries, and in the Kingdom of Italy, it lasted until 1912. However, the language barrier isn't the only challenge. Throughout your life, you've interacted with countless people and faced various illnesses. Even if you're currently healthy, your body carries a host of microorganisms that have evolved alongside humans. Throughout evolution, these microorganisms have become more aggressive, learning to resist various treatments. Despite the modern fear surrounding sanitation in medieval settlements, your arrival could prove to be more dangerous for the locals than for yourself. Moreover, the vaccinations you've received for protection against tetanus, tuberculosis, measles, and hepatitis are merely dreams for the medieval inhabitants. However, once you reach a settlement and find a way to communicate with the locals, you should realistically expect to be taken in by someone, avoiding starvation and working the fields for the rest of your life, enriching the local feudal lord. That's under favorable circumstances. More likely, you'd be mistaken for a runaway serf, and after an extended interrogation, it would turn out that this is indeed the case. Runaway serfs, whether in Eastern Europe, where they tried to escape into uncharted steppes and became known as uchodniki, eventually forming the Cossacks, or in Western and Central Europe, where they banded together and hid in the forests. But in our somewhat romanticized version of the Middle Ages, here you are standing in front of a weapon shop, free, ambitious, and even possessing some coins that you can't quite explain the origin of. But what if things are a bit closer to reality, and you find yourself among an unexpectedly wealthy arsenal of robbers who decide to take you in? You're just an ordinary person, not a professional athlete, and you've never been into fencing or reenactments. What weapon would you choose? Most likely, you'd reach for a sword or some other bladed weapon. While it's a common belief that a sword is a heavy and complicated weapon to master, that's not entirely true. The basics of slashing and thrusting are, for the most part, intuitive to everyone. A sword can be dangerous in any hands, but there are a few nuances to consider. For instance, effectively parrying upward strikes often involves a specific technique known as falling the blade. During this move, the sword rotates halfway. This action becomes second nature through practice and training. An untrained person would simply extend their arm forward and downward with the sword, making their defense less effective. Overall, it's challenging to describe fencing techniques with words, especially when your familiarity with them is only superficial. It's enough to say that to use a sword most effectively, you need to make certain movements second nature, learn to parry correctly, and master various techniques, stances, and footwork. Additionally, swords can be expensive to acquire and maintain. It's quite possible to damage the blade or even break the weapon. However, even if you become proficient in sword fighting, it won't necessarily give you a significant advantage over other types of weapons. Striking any bladed weapon against a hard surface can lead to it slipping, risking your grip and sending it off course. Even a skillfully wielded sword can struggle against decent chainmail. In short, a sword is expensive, intricate, and not exactly practical. Plus, in modern historical fencing, thrusting attacks are typically off-limits, which means that even a well-trained reenactor's combat skills have their limits. So, let's get to the real question. What weapon should you pick? The first thing to consider is the weapon's intended purpose. Chances are, even if you found yourself in a fantasy medieval world, you wouldn't be heading to the battlefield. The main purpose would be self-defense, which means fighting off one or more attackers. In these duels, the distance of your strikes is crucial. Long pole weapons offer undeniable advantages. It's tough to defeat someone who keeps you out of striking range. We're not talking about massive pikes here, but a spear with a shaft around 6 feet long can keep your opponent at bay while delivering straightforward thrusts. These thrusts are actually more effective against armor than slashing attacks. In fact, the spear has remained relevant since nearly the dawn of our species and has been a staple throughout the ages of cold weaponry. Now, some might argue that a person with a shorter weapon is more mobile and can quickly close the distance, break the shaft, and so on. For those claims, I recommend heading to a local reenactor club and trying your hand at swinging a sword, or even better, those beloved daggers favored by game developers, against a spear, halberd, or any other polearm. It's not so easy to break or chop through a shaft made of yew or ash, especially unless you're striking it with a heavy two-handed sword. Anyone who loves firewood knows that even secured ash branches aren't easy to chop through. Plus, a spear can be a decent defense against wild animals. After all, that's how it was originally designed for hunting. However, the main drawback comes from its size. A person wielding a spear, for instance, might look a bit out of place in a city, and when it comes to defending yourself in tight spaces, things can get tricky. However, in an open battlefield, you can throw your spear at an enemy and then close in for closer combat. But what weapon is the simplest and most effective for close quarters? Many might think of the axe, but in my opinion, it has a few drawbacks. First, when striking a hard surface, it can twist in your hand, though the elongated shape of the handle helps to mitigate this somewhat. Secondly, it can get stuck in an enemy's wound or protective gear. Thirdly, during a fight, the blade can dull quickly, causing the weapon to lose its effectiveness. However, there is weaponry that avoids all these drawbacks, is simple to use, has a great stopping power, and delivers what's known as perforating action. Naturally, I'm talking about the spear and its later version, the halberd. Mastering this weapon involves delivering quick, straightforward strikes. These blows often aren't lethal and don't result in puncture wounds, but they can quickly take an opponent out of the fight. Due to its mass and decent energy, it's tough to deflect strikes from a bludgeoning weapon with a blade. However, the mace itself, like most cold weapons, isn't designed for parrying at all, so it should ideally be paired with a shield. It's worth noting that many people see a shield as a simple piece of equipment providing good passive protection. In reality, using a typical medieval round shield requires skill, and it's not as easy as it may seem to many. By the way, a shield can also be used for protection against rain during campaigns. Just be careful not to catch a lightning bolt on the boss. And with a large tower shield, you could even create an improvised shelter. Interestingly, while maces don't show up as often in books and movies, I've come across a quote from the well-known weapon historian Edward Oakeshott, stating that in European collections of medieval weaponry, there are more maces than axes and warhammers combined. Since the Bronze Age, maces have taken on the role of insignias, symbols of power, which can be traced throughout history in various forms. The weight of a medieval mace typically didn't exceed around 3 pounds, often hovering around 2.5 pounds. In earlier times, when armor was lighter, most examples weighed up to 1.75 pounds. To inflict serious damage on an unarmored person, a head weighing about 7 ounces is sufficient. The handle length usually ranged from about 2 to 3 feet. You need to have strong wrists. It's not about having incredible strength. From personal experience, if you spend a year at an office job and then go to join a reenactment group to clang some metal or hit wooden replicas, your wrists might get sore, as they say, within just a few minutes of fencing. Overall, you could sum it up like this: pole and bludgeoning weapons are the best means of self-defense in an abstract medieval setting. If you have your own thoughts on this topic, feel free to share them in the comments.